Hi, and welcome to this section of the tutor where we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about another topic that's really, really important, and that's the topic of percents. You probably heard about percents. Somebody says on the weather, on the TV or something like that on the news, like there's a 40% chance of rain tomorrow, or there's a 10% chance of rain tomorrow, or there's a 100% chance of rain tomorrow, something like that. And that's something that's all around us, and it's something that's important for us to know. So the question is, what is a percent? What does it mean when we say that there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow, okay? The thing to remember is the word percent means per 100. Cent is kind of a French word. It means 100. So percent means something compared to 100. That's kind of what it means. So when someone says 50% or 60% or 30% or 10% or something like this, all they're doing is they're taking a number and they're comparing it to 100. And that kind of gives you a feeling for how close something is to 100. And it's a useful comparison to make. So let's go ahead and figure out by doing some work on the board what percent really is and what it means to us. Okay? So the thing to remember is percent, okay, percent, that's how you say percent, is just simply comparing a number to 100, to the number 100. That's all it means, okay? So to take an example of that, somebody might say 10% or something like this. So they would write 10 and then put this little symbol over here, and that means percent, 10%, okay? Now the question is, what does it mean, okay? Now what I told you already is that percent is comparing a number to 100. So when you write down 10%, all you're doing is you're saying 10 compared with 100, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to write that down in a way that we're going to be able to see what we're talking about. So I'm going to write the 10 down here, okay? And I'm going to write 100 down underneath it, okay? So I'm going to write a fraction down, okay? Because what we're doing here is anytime you have 10%, what it means is 10 in comparison to 100. So I'm just going to write the 10 on the top and the 100 on the bottom because those are the two numbers that I'm interested in. 10 compared to 100. Now if you just think about it in your head here, 10, the number 10, isn't too close to 100, okay? 10 is pretty far away from 100. 50 is much closer to 100. 75 is even closer to 100. 99 is really, really close to 100. So all you're doing is you have this sliding, the scale here. Here's 0 and here's 100. And when you express a percent, you're just figuring out where in the middle you are with respect to 100. And we'll see why that's useful here in a minute. But for now, we're going to write this as a fraction, 10 compared to 100. And I'm going to put it as a fraction there. Now, just like with any fraction, you can simplify this fraction. Okay? You can simplify this fraction. This is a fraction that can be simplified. You can divide the top by 10, and you can divide the bottom also by 10. And that'll simplify this fraction. 10 divided by 10 gives you 1, and 100 divided by 10 gives you 10. Okay? So 10%, okay, is the same thing basically as 10 over 100, okay, but I can simplify that to 1 over 10, okay. Now if you go back and look at the section on dividing decimals or dividing fractions, you could set up a division here, okay. You could say 1, and I can divide 10 into it. This is 1 divided by 10. That's what a fraction is, 1 divided by 10. And I could do this long division, and when you would do that, you would see that this comes out to 0.10 in a decimal form. Okay, I have a lot of stuff on the board here, and it may not make a lot of sense, so I'm going to back up and I'm going to explain everything to you here, okay? 10% is a number compared to 100. It's used to tell us how close we are to 100, okay? And you'll see why later when we work on some problems, okay? So we write this, when we compare it to 100, as 10 over 100. This is a fraction here, okay? We're just comparing it to 100. Now I can simplify this fraction by doing this and dividing by 10 here on the top and the bottom, and I get 1/10, okay? So 10% is the same thing as this fraction 1/10. And I know from my decimals that if I do this long division here, 1 divided by 10, it will be 0.10. Now notice, okay, 10% is equal to 0.10, okay? So all you have to do for a percent, if you want to convert it to a decimal like this, you just take, there's an imaginary decimal point here, you just move it to the left 2 places, 0.10, you just move it to the left 2 places, and you'll get the decimal equivalent of that, okay? So let's take another percent, okay? 25%. This is 25 compared to 100, and it's a bigger percent, so we're closer to 100, okay? So as a fraction, we would write that as 25 over 100 because we're comparing it to 100, right? And this is just a fraction like anything else, so we can simplify fractions, okay? We can divide the top by 25, and we can divide the bottom by 25 because it's just a fraction, okay? So the top is going to be 25 divided by 25, which is 1. The bottom is 100 divided by 25, which is 4. So 25% is the same thing as the fraction 1/4, okay? So remember back from your pie, okay? If I cut the pie in 4 pieces, this is 1/4, okay? This is 1/4 of a pie, okay? Well, what this is saying is 1/4 of a pie is the same thing as 25% of a pie, okay? So really percentages, because you're comparing them to 100, okay? It's just another way of kind of saying a fraction. It's just another way of kind of expressing what a fraction is. 1/4 is equal to 25%, okay? Now, if you were to actually do this division, 1 divided by 4, and do the long division, you would find out that if you wanted to write this as a decimal, it'd be 0.25, okay? Now, notice again, to take the percent and convert directly to the decimal, it's real easy. You just take the decimal point here and move it 2 places to the left, and this is your decimal. So some problems may ask you, they may give you a percent, and they may say, what is the fraction that is the same thing as this percent? Well, all you do is you take the percent, you put 100 on the bottom, you simplify it, and then you'll get your fraction. And if they ask you, well, what is the decimal equivalent of this percent, you just move the decimal 2 places to the left, okay? Another example would be 50%, okay? 50%, okay? If you want to convert this to a fraction, you'll just take the 50 and you'll put it over 100, okay? Which is what we always do here. And then this is a fraction just like anything else, so you can simplify this and you could say, okay, I can divide the top by 50 and I can divide the bottom by 50, okay? And I know that that's going to simplify things for me, okay? 50 divided by 50 is 1, and 100 divided by 50 is 2. So what we figured out here is that 50% is exactly the same thing as 1/2, okay? Is exactly the same thing as 1/2. So in this case, what we're saying is that 50% is the very same thing as 1/2, and we did that because what 50% means is 50 compared to 100, or as a fraction, 50 over 100, which reduces to 1/2. So in pie form, in terms of what we were talking about in terms of the pies earlier, here is half of a pie, okay? So half of a pie is 50% of a pie. So now you know what it kind of means when the weatherman says, there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow. What that means is that 50 times out of 100, 50 times out of 100, it'll rain tomorrow, okay? Or about half the time. So it's not an exact science, the weather, you know, they can't exactly predict it with 100% accuracy, but on average, about 50% chance tomorrow, so it may or it may not rain, about 50-50, about half the time it will and half the time it won't. It's just hard exactly to predict. If you had something more like 95% chance of rain tomorrow, then you would know that it's almost guaranteed to rain because 95% is almost very close to 100, and that's what we're comparing to. We're comparing to 100, okay? So it's just a way to compare, you know, and to kind of give a probability almost. Is what exactly is what a percentage is. It gives you an idea the certainty in which something will happen. Okay, so just kind of going down the line here, if we had 75%, okay, just to kind of be totally clear here, that would be 75 over 100. That's my fraction, okay, because 75% means 75 over 100. And can I simplify this fraction? Well, sure I can. I can divide the top by 25 and the bottom by 25, okay? And when I do that, 75 divided by 25 is going to give me 3, and 100 divided by 25 is going to give me 4, okay? So 75% is the same thing as 3/4, and if you remember in terms of the pie, that's 3 pieces shaded out of 4, so we're getting closer and closer to filling up the whole pie. So over here, backing up a second over here, 50% is 0.50 and 75% is 0.75. And all you do is you take the decimal and you move it 2 places. So lots of problems may ask you, they may give you a percentage and say, find the decimal. Okay, and all you do is you just move the decimal point 2 points to the left. And that's the answer. It's really simple. And if they want to ask you to convert it to a fraction, you just take the percentage, put it over 100, and simplify the fraction. Now, one more thing that I want to write, I kind of ran out of room here on the bottom, so I'm going to write it up here at the top, is the following. What would 100% be? Okay, 100%. Well, in terms of a fraction, that's 100 over 100, okay? And you already know that 100 over 100, anything divided by itself is 1. So that's the same thing as 1, okay? So what I'm trying to point out here is a percentage. When you increase the number in terms of percent and you get closer and closer to 100, all it means is that the fractional, you're basically comparing it in terms of how close you are to 100. So if you had, 50% of the apples in a basket were rotten, okay? Then that would mean, using what we learned here, that about half of the apples are going to be rotten. If you were going to say that 75% of the kids in class were sick with the flu, okay, then that would mean that 75%, which is roughly 3/4, okay, which is a fair amount of the class, it's more than 50%, it's 75%, it's 3/4 of the students have the flu, okay? And if in terms of a decimal, that's 0.75, okay? So it's a really useful way to kind of apply to problems when you have a bunch of people or a bunch of apples or the weather or something like that, and you're trying to express what fraction of those people, are sick or something like this. Instead of just using the fraction, you can use a percentage. And you'll see that a lot in real life. Percentages are used a lot in real life. They're used in the weather. Okay, obviously you've seen that on TV. They're used in your grades. Your grades are a fantastic, a way to talk about percentages. When you get a perfect score on your test, it's 100%, right? When you get 100 on your test, it's 100%, okay? That means of all the questions on the test, you got them all right. If you got an 85 on the test, it's an okay grade. I mean, it's a B, okay? An 85 is 85% of a perfect score, okay? If you get like a 60 or a 50 on your test, it's a pretty bad grade. A 50% on your test would mean that you got half the questions wrong, okay? So that's what percent means. We're going to work a couple of percent problems that you'll commonly see. If a problem says, convert this fraction to a percent, how would you do that? Convert this fraction to a percent. Well, this is a fraction. You can draw your pie graph, make 10 pieces, and you can shade 2 of those pieces, and that would be true. How would you convert this to percent? The trick is, you need to transform this fraction so that the bottom number is 100. Because then, remember in the other problems we had 100 on the bottom, then you will have it in terms of percent. So how can I do that? I can multiply the bottom by 10, which will give me 100, but I got to do the same thing to the top. I can do the same thing to the top and the bottom of the fraction, as long as I do it to both. So on the top, 2 times 10 is 20, and on the bottom, 10 times 10 is 100. Now that I have it in terms of 20 over 100, it's real easy because anything over 100, you can just write as the top number with a percent sign, 20%. Okay, we just learned that just a minute ago. So that's kind of the common theme in these problems. What if you had 6 over 25? Well, how would you convert this to percent? The easiest way is to multiply the top and the bottom of this fraction by something that will give the bottom number 100. Okay? So the reason I did this was because on the top, 6 times 4 is 24, and 25 times 4 gives me that 100 I'm looking for. So anytime I've got it in terms of something over 100, I just say, okay, I'll take the top number and I put a percent sign. So this is 24%. So what this means is that the fraction 6/25 is the same thing as 24% of something. What if I had 7 over 50? Well, I think you can kind of see the common theme here. You just pick a number that you can multiply by. In this case, it's going to be 2. So after doing this multiplication, on the top, 7 times 2 is 14, and on the bottom, 2 times 50 is 100, which is what I'm after. Okay, and so now that I have it as 14 over 100, you just have 14%. That's the answer here. So if you ever asked a problem on how to convert a fraction to a percent, all you need to do is multiply top and bottom by something so the bottom becomes 100, and then the top number is just going to be your percentage, because what you're doing there is you're converting the fraction and having a denominator of 100. Now, what if you had a problem that told you something like, here's 0.7, that's a decimal. Convert that to a percent. A lot of times they'll give you a decimal and they'll say, well, what percentage is that? Well, remember when I was telling you earlier, in general, like 75% is just 0.75, and 65%, for instance, was just 0.65. All you do is you take that decimal point here, that implied decimal point, you move it to the left 2 times, and then that's your decimal. Well, that little fact, which is just something you need to remember, is like makes these kinds of problems super easy, because 0.7, if you move the decimal point to the right 2 places, is just going to be 70%. Because if you look at it starting from this end, 70. If you take the decimal point left and then left, you're going to get 0.70, right? And 0.70 is exactly the same thing as 0.7. Remember, you can have trailing zeros after a decimal point as far off as you want. They don't really add anything to it. So there's kind of an implied 0 right here, and that's why you have 70% there. So it's real easy to take a decimal and make it into a percent. It's almost not even worth writing down the steps. 0.93, okay, how would you convert that to a percentage? Very simple. You just take that decimal and you move it 2 points to the right, so 93%. Okay? It's real easy. Okay? Now what we're going to do is we're going to work a couple of quick problems. I'm going to tell you what the problem is, and then we're going to kind of work it out. And they're going to be sort of like word problems, but not quite so long. You have 10 students in a class. 50% of them have A's. How many students in the class have A's? So there's 10 students in the class. Okay? 50% have A's. Okay? How many have A's? And this is the kind of problem you'll get into a lot, where you'll have a percentage, like 50%, tell you how many students have whatever, and then you'll know how many students. Well, what you do here, okay, it's real easy. You have 10 students in the class, okay? So that's a number we know. The 50%, okay, remember how I told you to write that as a decimal, right? You can take that as a decimal, and you can write that as 0.5. Oh, okay, or 0.5 is the same thing. You just take that and you move it twice to the right. And also just remember that it's the same thing as 1/2. We did that before on the other board. We took 50 over 100, simplified that fraction, get a half. Either way here, okay? So for this problem, I'm going to go ahead and use the fraction, because I'm going to try to give you a flavor for how to do things differently. All you do is you take the 10 people in class and multiply by the fraction of people that have A's. So it's going to be 1/2, okay? 10 times 1/2, okay? Because what we're saying is, since 50% have A's, a half of the students have A's. And this is kind of getting a little bit into word problem territory, but anytime you have so many students in the class, you know, half of them have A's, or anytime you see the word of, almost always you're going to have to multiply, okay? So what you know here is that half of the students have A's, so we're going to multiply by 10. And to do this, we're going to go ahead and put 10 over 1, because we're going to be multiplying fractions. 10 over 1 is equal to 10, okay? Because anything divided by 1 is just itself. So again, to multiply fractions, 10 times 1 is 10, and on the bottom, 1 times 2 is 2. And then this is just a fraction you can divide. 10 divided by 2 will give you 5. So 5 students in the class have A's. Now let's see if that makes sense. We should always do that. 10 students are in the entire class. 50%, which is half of them, have A's. And so it kind of makes sense to you that if half of them have A's, then 5 students must be the 5 that have the A's. Okay? So not that hard. What you need to do in these cases with percentages is multiply by either the fraction, or you can also multiply by the decimal. You'll get the same answer. Okay? So in this next problem, you have 12 pencils. 25% of the pencils have broken lead. How many pencils have broken lead? So again, you have 12 pencils. and 25% have broken lead. Okay? How many have broken lead? Okay? That's what we're trying to find out. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to take the 12 pencils that we have and multiply by the 25%. Okay, we're going to multiply by the 25%, but we're going to do it a little bit differently. 25% is the same thing as 0.25, and we just learned that before because you just take that decimal point here, move it 2 points to the right, or you could start here and 2 points to the left. That's how you convert to decimal. And since we started with 12 pencils to begin with, we're just going to multiply by our percentage, which we're going to multiply by the 0.25. Okay? You never multiply by the number in front of the percent here. In other words, 25% is telling you how it compares to 100, but you're never going to multiply by 25, okay? You've got to either convert that to a fraction, which we did in the previous problem, or into a decimal, okay? That's why I taught you how to convert to decimals. So how do we do this multiplication? I've already taught you this. 2 times 5 is 10, so I put a 0, carry the 1. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 1 is 6, okay? Now we're going to move to the next digit, and because we're going to do that, we'll add a 0. 2 times 2 is 4, and 2 times 1 is 2. Okay? So now we add these up. 0 plus 0 is 0. 6 plus 4 is 10, carry the 1. And 2 plus 1 is 3. Okay? And then finally, because it's a decimal, we have to move the decimal point. There are 2 decimal places after the decimal point here. So we start at the right and move left 1, 2. And if any of this is unfamiliar, then go ahead and go back to the section on multiplying decimals. We have 2 digits after the decimal, so move the digit over here. So what we have is 3.00, which is the same thing as 3 pencils that have broken lead. Okay? So that kind of makes sense. Let's think about it. You start with 12 pencils. 1/4, which is the same thing as 25%, 1/4. I didn't write that before, that wasn't needed, but you know from the previous board it's 1/4 of the pencils have broken lead. So it kind of makes sense that 3 of them would have broken lead because, you know, it kind of just, I'm getting you to do a little bit of a sanity check here to make sure that it works. Okay? 6 is 12 divided by 2. So we know that 1/4 is less than that, and so 3 is right at 1/4. So what you do is you just take the number that you start with and multiply by your percentage, but you got to convert that percentage in order to do it. Okay? And this is the kind of stuff this is the kind of reasons why percentages are really useful. You'll find lots of times percentages kind of tell you how many of a certain number of things are behaving in a way. Let's say you have 20 cars in a parking lot, 75% of them are blue. How many cars are blue? So you have 20 cars, 75% are blue. The question is, how many cars are blue? Okay? Well, you want to take the 75 and convert to a decimal. So that's 0.75. Okay? So all you're going to do is you're going to take the 20 cars total in the lot and you're going to multiply by 0.75. Like this. Okay? Because multiplying by this decimal chops down this total number and tells me how many cars are actually blue. Okay? So let's do this. 5 times 0 gives me 0. 2 times 5 gives me 10. Add a 0 here. 7 times 0 gives me 0. 2 times 7 is 14. Let's add these up. 0 plus 0 is 0. 0 plus 0 is 0. 4 plus 1 is 5. And then we'll just drop the 1 down here. And then we have 2 digits after the decimal. So we start here and we go left 1, 2. Put a decimal point here. 15.00 is the same thing as 15 cars in the parking lot are blue. And that makes sense because if 75% of them are blue, that means a majority of them are blue. Okay? And so out of 20 cars, 15 are blue, so the answer kind of makes sense. So again, you just multiply by the percentage. So a couple main things to know in this lesson. A percent is just comparing a number to 100. It's basically kind of a fraction. You take that percentage, you put it over 100, and it is a fraction. You can also convert them to decimals really easily, like I've told you here. You just move that decimal point 2 places. Okay? And the reason that they're useful is for problems like this. When you're given a total number of something and a percentage of students or people or whatever it is you're talking about, behave in a certain way, well then you can calculate using the percentages just by multiplication exactly how many, in this case, how many cars were blue, etc. It's also very useful for understanding the weatherman on TV. And when they talk about 45% chance of rain, I'm going to be a whole lot more worried if it's a 90% chance of rain than if it's a 20% chance of rain, because 90 is a whole lot closer to 100. And if they ever come out and tell you it's a 100% chance of rain, that means it definitely will rain. No question about it. No question about it. And that is a good introduction to percents.